Hey guys, tonight we're slipping through the velvet curtains of power, past the rustle of silk robes, and into the hush of royal corridors to uncover something you've probably never heard in a history class. Not court politics, not epic battles, but something far more intimate. Tonight, you're going to find out what sex was really like inside royal palaces. Imagine candlelight flickering against gilded walls, the heavy scent of perfumes clinging to thick brocaded drapes, and the ever-present whisper of servants on the other side of thin wooden doors. In this world, nothing was truly private, not even your most personal moments. Behind all the pomp and glitter, those grand palaces held secrets that would make even modern tabloids blush. And you're about to wander right into them. You probably won't survive this, at least not without raising your eyebrows. Because once you step into the world of royal bedrooms, you'll see that being a king or queen didn't mean romance and roses. It meant pressure. It meant ritual. It meant duty. And sometimes, it meant danger. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the antechamber of a 17th century palace, perhaps Versailles. The air is thick with musk lavender oil and a hint of sweat. Behind you, a pair of guards speaks softly. Ahead, the Queen's apartments wait, as ornate and sacred as a chapel. But here's the thing, what you're about to witness isn't just a private affair. It's a public ritual. In many royal courts, especially in Europe, sex wasn't entirely your business. If you were king, your ability to produce an heir was national concern. That meant there were protocols for consummation. Witnesses weren't just hovering for scandal, they were ensuring dynastic stability. You don't just close the door, you perform. And if you're the queen while your body isn't entirely your own, it's more like state property. From the moment you step into your royal role, everything revolves around fertility, chastity, and the hope of a legitimate male heir. The bedchamber wasn't always an erotic sanctuary. Often it was theater. French kings like Louis XIV had lever and coucher ceremonies. Literally getting up and going to bed were royal performances with attendants present. You were dressed and undressed by a hierarchy of nobles, each assigned their task. And if a romantic moment came afterward, well, you'd better hope your libido could work through the smell of rosewater and 10 staring courtiers. Let's take a moment and drift into one of those rooms. Thick damask curtains surround the bed. A velvet rope keeps lesser servants at bay. The bed itself isn't soft. It's stiff, built high to show off luxury rather than comfort. A chamberlain might discreetly bow before drawing the curtains closed. Sometimes that was the extent of privacy. Now imagine being watched not by voyeurs, but by obligation. In some cultures, particularly among nobility in medieval and Renaissance Europe, witnesses to the consummation weren't unheard of. In Spain and parts of France, 2 witnesses might stand near the chamber door. In some Eastern courts, it was more explicit, with actual observers verifying the act. This wasn't out of kink, it was legal protocol. It protected inheritances and thrones. If a marriage was challenged later, those witnesses could say, yes, it was consummated. Or worse, no, it wasn't. Sex then wasn't just for love. It was the duty of dynasties. Your ability to perform could make or break an alliance. Marriages were often arranged when the couple were barely past puberty. A 13-year-old girl might be handed to a 15-year-old boy, both instructed on their duty by elder courtiers, physicians, or priests. Virginity was prized, but experience was expected. The contradictions were dizzying. Even more tangled were the layers of manipulation. For example, in Tudor England, advisors might scrutinize signs of pregnancy in queens as though examining crops. She looked queasy this morning. Could she be with child? Whole councils would delay wars or treaties waiting to confirm a pregnancy. And if the queen failed to conceive, whispers of witchcraft or impotence began to swirl. And let's not pretend royal sex was always consensual. Especially for queens, there was often little choice. Refusing the king wasn't just a personal rejection. It could be seen as political sabotage. Worse, in some realms, failure to produce an heir was considered grounds for annulment, exile, or worse. Your worth was measured in belly growth. Take a breath. Let that sink in. You're drifting further into those candlelit rooms where gowns are loosened not by romance but by routine. Where nights are counted not in intimacy but in chances to conceive. And if you failed to conceive, the blame almost never fell on the king. You could be replaced. Royal mistresses add another twist. Kings often had official lovers. In Versailles, mistresses like Madame de Pompadour had their own apartments near the king's chambers. These women weren't just flings. They were political players, cultural influencers, and often deeply involved in royal decision-making. But even they had a role to play in maintaining appearances. They were allowed sexual power, but only as long as they served the crown. And meanwhile, the queens were often left isolated, measured against each failed month, each silent womb. You can feel the quiet pressure now, can't you? Even bedding ceremonies, those ornate events marking the start of royal marriages, were drenched in scrutiny. In England, the couple was paraded through the court, kissed in front of nobility, then led to the bed. Everyone cheered. Then they were left alone, expected to make the first royal child. Sleep didn't come easy under that weight. You roll over on the stiff mattress, hearing every creak as servants shuffle beyond the wall. Somewhere a guard coughs. The queen turns her head away, eyes wide open. The king sighs and begins the ritual yet again. This wasn't just sex. It was legacy. And you haven't even left the first century of this tale. You're still there in that stifling chamber, thick with expectation and the scent of royal oils. The door is shut, but the pressure seeps through the very stone. What happens between those sheets won't just be whispered about by gossipy courtiers. It'll ripple through treaties, shape dynasties, and perhaps even determine the next war. And you lying there are painfully aware of it. Let's stay in France a bit longer, because no royal court better perfected the art of staged intimacy than Versailles. Louis XIV, the Sun King, didn't merely shine in the realm of politics. He radiated dominance through his personal life. He had a string of mistresses, some discreet, some flaunted like fashion accessories. The king's virility was a matter of national pride. His mistresses weren't just tolerated, they were sometimes celebrated. Portraits of Madame de Montespan or Madame de Maintenon hung not in shame but in gilded halls. You'd think the queen might resent this, and often she did. But she couldn't speak of it. In fact, royal mistresses were so formalized that they had their own titles, maîtresse en titre. It was a job with expectations and political weight. Their influence extended far beyond the bedroom. Yet even with that power, they too were prisoners of the king's desire and courtly approval. One wrong move, one faded beauty mark, and they could be cast aside. Now imagine being that mistress. You're summoned not by secret letter or shy glance, but by court protocol. A servant approaches with a knowing nod, perhaps in the middle of a card game or supper. You rise, everyone pretends not to notice, but they all do. Tonight, you'll lie beside the most powerful man in Europe, but you're not there for pleasure. You're there because you're needed, you're expected, and expectations were everything. Performance anxiety wasn't a whispered modern problem. It was historical dynamite. Take the young Charles II of Spain. Born with numerous physical and mental health problems due to generations of royal inbreeding, he couldn't consummate his marriage. His court descended into hysteria. Doctors examined his body. Priests performed blessings. Spies monitored the couple's every move. But nothing could produce an heir. Sex, in his case, was a terrifying impossibility. His failure in bed spelled the eventual collapse of the Spanish Habsburg line. Royal sex wasn't always physical, it was symbolic. In England, when Queen Elizabeth I refused to marry, rumors swirled for decades. Was she secretly celibate? Was she barren? Was she hiding a forbidden love affair? In reality, Elizabeth understood something crucial: sex, or even the possibility of it, was power. By remaining the Virgin Queen, she turned her body into a national symbol. She never had to prove herself in bed because she turned not sleeping with anyone into a political strategy. But let's slip away from monarchs and look toward their staff, because nothing about palace sex happened in isolation. The bedroom was a crowded place, metaphorically, and sometimes literally. Servants often helped undress the king or queen. Maids changed the sheets. Midwives examined the aftermath. Royal intimacy was a relay race of participants. And secrets, those were currency. If a maid noticed signs of pregnancy, she might share it with a rival noble. If a valet overheard something through the walls, he could rise in court favor by telling the right person. Gossip traveled faster than candlelight, and one moan behind closed doors could change alliances overnight. You may be thinking, what about love? Well, it existed, but cautiously. Genuine affection was rare, especially in arranged marriages. Some royal couples found tenderness over time. Others remained icy strangers forced into mechanical rituals. Take Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. They married young and for years failed to consummate their union. The entire court whispered about it. Political pamphlets mocked it. Finally, after pressure from both sides, they succeeded and promptly began having children. But those early years of awkward avoidance weren't private. They were dissected like battlefield failures. And in the East, things could be even more elaborate. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's harem wasn't a fantasy of free love. It was a machine of strict hierarchy and political intrigue. Concubines were selected for beauty, intelligence, and obedience. They were trained in etiquette, conversation, even poetry, so that when the Sultan summoned one, the encounter would reflect his own divine refinement. But once again, it was never just about pleasure. The ultimate goal was to produce sons, heirs, alliances. And women who bore sons, they were elevated sometimes above the Queen Mother herself. Now picture that again. You're one of dozens, sometimes hundreds of women confined to gilded cages. You're waiting dressed in the softest silks, taught how to walk, speak, seduce, but you have no choice about when or if you're summoned, and if you never are. You fade into decorative irrelevance like a painting nobody notices anymore. Even the architecture of palaces shaped intimacy. In castles and fortresses, bedrooms were often cold, echoing chambers with tapestries to trap heat and noise. The large canopied beds weren't for privacy, but for warmth and symbolism. They were so high you needed stools to climb into them. And still, intimacy happened in those drafty rooms under those heavy covers, sometimes with a prayer, mumbled beforehand, not for love but for conception. Because in every palace, in every century, sex wasn't just a human act, it was a dynastic transaction. And so you shift again, imagining yourself as the queen, perhaps, or the mistress, or the trembling servant girl who caught a king's eye. In any of those roles, your body wasn't entirely your own. You were a pawn on the silk-draped chessboard of succession. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of those expectations settle. There were moments of tenderness, yes. A quiet glance, a shared joke, a night when passion did not feel like pressure. But even then, shadows loomed. What if someone saw? What if someone told? What if this act created not joy but scandal, or worse, nothing at all? And if there was nothing, you might wake tomorrow to rumors. You might be replaced, because in royal palaces the only thing more dangerous than sex was not having it. Now drift deeper into the palace, past the heavy velvet curtains beneath the painted ceilings of gods and lovers, and through narrow passageways known only to the most trusted staff. The moonlight barely reaches here. Candles flicker in wall sconces, casting long shadows over centuries of whispered secrets. The air is warm, still laced with incense and desire, but not the kind you might imagine, because in royal palaces, desire was tangled, strained, and wrapped in the suffocating silk of duty. You find yourself near the royal nursery, a strange place to begin when speaking of sex, but in truth, this is where every royal tryst was supposed to end. A child, preferably a boy, preferably healthy, preferably legitimate. The word preferably, though, always carried danger because any deviation invited suspicion, accusation, or worse, replacement. If you were a royal woman, your womb was the centerpiece of your power and your peril. Let's pause with Anne Boleyn, shall we? Her affair with King Henry VIII wasn't just scandalous, it was strategic. He tore an entire church away from Rome for her. And when their relationship became official, the expectation was singular, a male heir. Anne delivered a daughter, Elizabeth, yes, but still a disappointment in that moment. Then came miscarriages, stillbirths, whispers, witchcraft, adultery, treason, and then execution. What sealed her fate wasn't the affair that started it all, but the sex that failed to fulfill its purpose. Do you feel the cold edge of that pressure now? You're lying beneath tapestries embroidered with gold, and yet you're more prisoner than queen. Every sigh of pleasure, every failed conception, every delay in menstruation is tracked like troop movements in war. You're given diets to improve fertility. You're forbidden certain activities. You may even be observed by court physicians to ensure your body is functioning as it should. Sex is no longer a choice. It's a performance evaluated, annotated, judged. And for men, the pressure was just as heavy, only cloaked in different robes. A king's virility was symbolic of his authority. If he failed to produce children, people whispered of weakness, moral, physical, even spiritual. So if a royal couple wasn't conceiving, the blame rarely rested on the man. But if it did, oh, the consequences. In some cases, kings faked it, literally. Stories exist of rulers who, upon hearing news that a child had been born from one of their mistresses, eagerly claimed paternity, even if they hadn't laid eyes on her in months. It was safer to appear virile and promiscuous than to risk seeming impotent. Royal masculinity, you see, wasn't about fidelity. It was about fecundity. Meanwhile, sex education, if it existed at all, was bizarre and often cruel. Young royals were taught not by parents, but by courtiers, clerics, or physicians. Some were handed anatomical manuals, others offered confusing metaphors. And still others learned through arrangement, literally paired with more experienced partners to teach them what to do. It wasn't grooming per se, it was royal tradition. In France, for example, it wasn't unusual for a dauphin's mistress to be an older woman chosen to initiate him. Not romantically, not affectionately, but functionally, so that he could later do his duty with his wife. It was a system as clinical as it was corrupt. Now picture that scene. You're 15. Your bride is barely 14. Both of you have been drilled in etiquette, table manners, and Latin conjugations, but not in affection. On your wedding night, you're ceremonially undressed by nobles who place your clothes on stools as if removing armor. You're led to a bed. A bishop blesses it. Courtiers toast. Candles flicker. The door closes. Silence. Now what you're expected to figure it out. And not just figure it out, perform. Successfully. Because if you don't, there will be consequences. Rumors. Questions. Even interrogations. Take the marriage of Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur of England. The two were teenagers. Their union was celebrated with lavish fanfare. And yet, Arthur died young before the marriage could be thoroughly consummated. Or so Catherine claimed. Years later, that detail, that single night, that unproven moment, would determine whether her second marriage to Henry VIII was valid. The entire English Reformation hinged on a teenage sex act, or lack thereof. Can you imagine that weight on your shoulders? Now glide eastward again, this time to the Forbidden City in Imperial China. There, the emperor was surrounded by concubines, hundreds of them. The selection process for a concubine was grueling. They were examined for physical perfection, trained in etiquette, and assigned ranks. But intimacy with the emperor wasn't casual. It was scheduled, organized, heavily monitored. At night, the emperor would be presented with carved ivory tablets, each inscribed with a concubine's name. He'd select one, and that woman would be bathed, dressed, perfumed, and delivered to him, often in the nude, wrapped in silk sheets. Guards would record her name, the time she arrived, and whether the emperor engaged with her. It was less a seduction and more a state transaction. And yet, for these concubines, that night could change everything. If she conceived, her status skyrocketed. If she didn't, she might never be summoned again. You begin to see that royal sex wasn't merely intimate, it was bureaucratic. Even the Vatican couldn't fully escape the pull of palace sexuality. Though Catholic popes were to remain celibate, Renaissance Rome was infamous for its indulgence. Pope Alexander VI, formerly Rodrigo Borgia, openly acknowledged his mistresses and children. His papal apartments hosted banquets and orgies so infamous they became legend. The line between spiritual authority and lust blurred in those dark, candlelit rooms. And then there's the matter of records. Because royal sex was often documented, coded in journals, whispered in letters, even painted into murals under the guise of mythology. If you knew how to read the symbolism, you could decode entire histories of scandal and seduction. Swans, pears, lilies, mirrors each carried a double meaning. Imagine paging through a queen's diary. A brief line he visited after supper. To us, it might seem ordinary, but to historians that line could signal the moment a future king was conceived, or a scandal was born, or a marriage quietly died. It's quiet again now. The candles are lower. You've made your way past the grandeur, through the gossip, and into the raw truth. Sex in royal palaces was rarely romantic and almost never private. It was politicized, weaponized, sacred, and profane, and it shaped the course of nations. You sink deeper into the bed you've imagined all along now, no longer golden and regal, but just heavy, weighted with centuries of expectation. Tomorrow the world will wake to news of your body, of your bedroom. But tonight, for now, you rest beneath that canopy of embroidered lies. The palace grows colder as night deepens. The rush of ceremony has quieted, but the tension lingers thick and unmoving, like smoke that never fully dissipates. You lie in that bed, but your mind drifts wandering down shadowy halls of history, past closed doors where whispered desires once ignited dynasties, or destroyed them. Let's return to England, specifically to the Georgian court of the 18th century. You'd expect things might have grown more modern, more discreet. But in many ways, palace sex only became more peculiar. With advancements in medicine and courtly fashion, intimacy became a strange performance of science and seduction. Royal couples weren't always allowed time alone, even when trying to conceive. Courtiers gossiped about how often the royal couple retired. Servants reported on the king's vigor, and midwives, physicians, and even astrologers were consulted to determine optimal nights for conception. Suddenly, the bedroom looked less like a sanctuary and more like a clinical experiment. King George III and Queen Charlotte, for example, had 15 children. That kind of fertility was viewed not only as a personal triumph, but a national asset. While George's reign would later be plagued by mental illness, his sexual virility gave him a sort of invincibility in the eyes of the court, at least for a time. But you might be wondering what happened when a royal's desires turned elsewhere. That's when things got complicated. Because while kings were quietly or not so quietly permitted to take mistresses, queens were held to a different standard. A single rumor of infidelity could bring ruin. Not just personal shame, but political collapse. After all, how could a nation be certain of an heir's legitimacy if the queen's affections strayed? One case still echoes with its drama: Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, married to King Christian VII. Her husband was mentally unstable, erratic, and largely disinterested in governing, or her. Lonely and isolated, Caroline found solace in the company of Johann Friedrich Struensee, the royal physician. Their relationship blossomed into an affair, passionate, dangerous, and eventually fatal. When court rivals discovered the liaison, the scandal exploded. Struensee was arrested, publicly humiliated, and ultimately executed. Caroline was divorced and exiled, her name smeared across Europe, all because a queen sought tenderness where the crown had offered none. It's a sobering reminder for women in power: even love could be treason, and treason was a frequent bedfellow in royal bedrooms. Sex could be used as blackmail. Servants might catch glimpses of scandalous encounters, only to barter their silence for status. Ambitious courtiers might seduce their way upward toward proximity with the monarch. In some cases, foreign spies were embedded among the palace staff, watching not the war rooms but the sheets. A glance, a touch, a whispered promise — these were the tools of espionage, just as surely as codes and letters. Now your breathing slows. You're deeper into this maze of intimacy and intrigue. You follow the footsteps of someone like Madame du Barry, the last official mistress of Louis V. She wasn't of noble birth, and that fact both fascinated and enraged the court. Her rise was meteoric one day, a courtesan the next, occupying private apartments beside the king's. She received jewels, titles, influence. But the court never accepted her. She wasn't born for the game, and when the king died, she fell quickly. During the French Revolution, her head fell too beneath the guillotine. You feel the soft rustle of her gown as it sweeps past you in a memory. A woman who reached the heights of pleasure and power only to be pulled into history's cruel tide. But even in those most intimate roles, many royal partners had no choice. Enforced celibacy and enforced intimacy were two sides of the same coin. In Spain, during the reign of Philip IV, The court was so rigid that even the timing of intimacy was managed by religious calendars. Certain days were forbidden. Fasting periods limited frequency. Even in the face of dynastic need, the church's grip dictated what happened in the royal bed. And yet, despite all the rules, taboos, and expectations, the body still yearned. Royals, like anyone else, desired connection. They ached for touch that wasn't duty-bound, for sighs that didn't echo through the marble of politics. You find yourself wondering now, what did real love look like in all this one rare and tender example lived quietly in the life of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert? Though their marriage was arranged, it blossomed into something deep and affectionate. Victoria, famously reserved in public, wrote passionate letters to Albert. She adored him, depended on him, and mourned him for decades after his death. Their relationship was not free of pressure. 9 children were born after all. But for once, the royal bed held warmth, not only responsibility. And still, even Victoria felt the crushing weight of appearances. After Albert's death, she wore black for the rest of her life, not just as a widow, but as a monarch performing eternal mourning. Even her grief had to be regal. Let your imagination float across continents now. In Mughal India, the emperor's harem was a political institution. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of women lived behind walls accessible only to the emperor and eunuchs. These women weren't only lovers, they were poets, musicians, strategists. Some held significant influence. Others faded into anonymity. Sex in the harem wasn't just about pleasure, it was also surveillance. Women were pitted against one another. Allegiances shifted like sand. One favored knight could elevate your family's status. One misstep could end in exile or poison. In such confined spaces, even whispers could kill. Now you begin to see how palatial sex was never simple. It was never just a touch in the dark. It was ceremony, strategy, transaction. Love might live there, yes, but only in the quiet corners behind closed curtains and locked journals. Even pregnancy itself wasn't private. When a queen showed signs of carrying an heir, her every movement was scrutinized. Was she eating enough? Resting too much, a court physician might be assigned to monitor her daily checking. Everything from her appetite to the firmness of her belly. In some cases, queens were practically sequestered in the later months, attended round the clock by midwives and guards. And the birth. It was rarely a private affair. French tradition mandated that royal births be witnessed to prevent claims of substitution. When Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child, dozens of courtiers crammed into the room. She nearly suffocated from the heat and pressure. A doctor had to break a window to let in air. The baby was a girl. The disappointment in the room was as palpable as the sweat on her brow. And you lie there now, knowing what she felt. Your heart aches not for the crown, not for the jewels, but for one moment of peace. One moment of intimacy that doesn't echo with duty or dynasty. But in a royal palace, such peace is fleeting. The moment the child cries, your body becomes political again. And your future. It depends entirely on what that child is or isn't. So you close your eyes not to sleep, but to escape. To slip into a dream where royal sex isn't performance, nor strategy, nor pressure. Just touch, just trust, just silence. You wake before dawn, or at least you think you do. In this royal palace, time moves differently. The rhythm isn't set by sunrise or moonlight. It's set by expectations. A knock at the door, the rustle of servants preparing the queen's wardrobe, the priest murmuring morning prayers outside your chambers. Even before your feet touch the cold marble floor, your body is already spoken for. You're back inside the routine, the endless cycle where sex is not spontaneous, not even secret. It's scheduled, expected, and sometimes even orchestrated. Consider the Holy Roman Empire. There, the balance of church and throne meant that every bodily act carried moral weight. Emperors were often expected to perform not just as rulers, but as paragons of Christian virtue. Yet the paradox was sharp chastity was idealized, but heirs were demanded. So sex became a sacred contradiction. You were told to be pure, but fruitful, obedient, but fertile. Royal couples navigated this maze with the help of clergy and physicians, often at odds with one another. If you were a royal bride, your wedding night might begin with a prayer delivered not by your groom, but by a priest at your bedside. May this union be blessed, and may it bear fruit. Then a nod. The room empties, and you're left with the burden of fulfilling a prayer that everyone else will be monitoring tomorrow. The king leans in. You do not speak. This is not seduction. This is statecraft. And once the act is over, if it even happens, there is often a ritual. In some courts, the bed linens are examined. Stained sheets were proof of consummation. Witnesses might be called in. Maids trained in the art of discretion might carry away the evidence, eyes cast downward, but minds racing with the knowledge they now held. Now imagine that being your first time. This is the unspoken truth behind so many royal tales. The fairy tale weddings, the grand processions, the glittering gowns. Behind all of them was the quiet terror of that first night, the knowledge that pleasure was irrelevant. Success in the eyes of the court meant one thing only: pregnancy. The weight of fertility fell squarely on the woman's shoulders. If no child came, she was scorned. But even worse were the rumors. Was she secretly barren? Was she cursed? Was she punished for some hidden sin? And if a child did come but was malformed or weak, blame shifted instantly to her lineage, her behavior, her thoughts. Superstition was never far from the royal bed. In the Russian Empire, for example, it was believed that conception could be influenced by the stars, the phases of the moon, even the emotional state of the couple. Royal astrologers advised the Tsarina when she should lie with the Tsar, and if she failed to conceive, she might be sent to confession or undergo ritual cleansing. Intimacy became not just public, but spiritual warfare. The body in royal life was never just a body, it was a battlefield. And men, though praised for their virility, could fall too. If a king failed to perform, his crown might slip. In France, impotence was considered legal grounds for annulment, but proving it was another matter. There are documented cases of husbands being required to demonstrate their ability before a court. Yes, literally perform. These tests, administered by physicians and religious figures, reduced the human body to absurd spectacle. Think of the humiliation, the silence of the room, the judging eyes, all because a king failed to do what was expected in secret. And beyond the bed, politics swirled. If a queen bore no children, her enemies waited, ready to pounce, to suggest a new match, a new mistress, a new alliance. The bedroom in this world was never behind closed doors. It was center stage. But what of those who loved outside the rules? Occasionally, a monarch fell for someone the court deemed unworthy. A servant, a musician, a commoner. And that love, if they dared call it that, was met with fury. Consider the story of King Edward VIII of Britain. In the 20th century, long after the age of candlelit chambers, he still couldn't marry the woman he loved. Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, was seen as politically and morally unacceptable, and so Edward gave up the throne. abdicated, all because of love, or sex, or both. You wonder now what kind of world punishes intimacy so severely. In earlier centuries, punishment could be far more brutal. For noble women accused of infidelity, the results could be fatal. The slightest rumor might lead to house arrest, public shaming, even death. For men, the consequences were often milder, unless their affair threatened the line of succession. One of the most harrowing tales is that of Sophie Dorothea of Celle, wife of the future King George III of Britain. Trapped in a loveless political marriage, she began an affair with a Swedish count. When they were discovered, the count was murdered, his body disposed of in secret. Sophie was imprisoned in a castle for over 30 years, never to see her children again. Her crime, loving someone else, seeking warmth outside the cold structure of royal obligation. You can almost hear her now, in the dark behind stone walls, still dressed in silks but shivering all the same. But even when passion did flourish inside a royal match, it rarely came without surveillance. Love letters were intercepted, gifts scrutinized, servants eavesdropped, and privacy was never guaranteed. Even the architecture of palaces betrayed lovers. Secret passageways allowed for midnight visits, but also for spies. Beds were often enormous, not for comfort, but to emphasize status. Curtains could muffle whispers, but not secrets, and there were those who sought to exploit it all. Fortune hunters, intriguers, individuals who saw the royal bed as a path to influence. The phrase pillow politics wasn't invented in the 20th century, it's centuries old. Royal mistresses could sway policy appointments, even war decisions, all from within those embroidered sheets. But it was a precarious power. Lose favor, grow old, or fail to amuse, and you were cast aside, forgotten. You lie still now, wrapped in imagined silk. You've walked through centuries of royal lust, fear, duty, and betrayal. The candles have burned low. The palace sleeps, and still you feel the echo. The heavy truth is this: in royal palaces, sex was rarely about desire. It was about consequence. And for those who lived it, pleasure was the most dangerous thing of all. The hour is deepest now. The palace slumbers, or so it seems. But behind those heavy doors and gilded panels, something is always stirring. If not bodies, then rumors. If not whispers, then schemes. Because while sleep may come to the courtiers and scribes, the business of royal sex never truly sleeps. You drift down another hallway in your mind, cool stone beneath your bare feet, the glow of a torch here and there lighting your way. You pause beside a door slightly ajar, and you listen. Inside, the conversation is hushed but unmistakable. A lady in waiting murmurs to a physician. They're not speaking of war or harvests. They're counting the days since the queen last bled. This is the unspoken rhythm of palace life. Beneath every feast and festivity, beneath the treaties and taxes, lies a deeper cycle, the cycle of a woman's body. Her fertility is the metronome by which the whole court dances, and everyone is watching. You shift again, and now you're not just an observer. You're a chambermaid. You carry linens, you refill basins, and you see everything. You notice which nights the king enters, which chambers. You note how long he stays. You see the queen's face the next morning, hopeful or resigned. You hear the midwife mutter about signs that may or may not mean something. And you keep your mouth shut because what you know could end lives or launch legacies. In some courts, servants like you were more than just silent watchers. They were participants in the theater of intimacy. Consider the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg courts. where the concept of honor dictated that a woman's virtue must be protected by layers of supervision. Maids were assigned to queens and princesses not only to dress and bathe them, but to guard their reputations. That meant observing, reporting, and intervening sometimes in the most personal moments. And yet even the most elaborate precautions couldn't stop rumors. Because if a queen miscarried in secret, the court might say she was never pregnant. If a child was born frail or disfigured, whispers of illegitimacy would slither through the hallways. If a king visited a mistress too often, the queen might be said to be barren by divine judgment. Everything, absolutely everything, was interpreted through the lens of sex and succession. You feel that pressure mounting again, don't you? Now drift with me to a northern castle, cold and windswept. This is Scandinavia. Here, too, royal bodies were under surveillance. During the union of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, under one crown in the late Middle Ages, political marriages were forged across kingdoms. But sex did not always follow. In some cases, the newlyweds couldn't even speak the same language. Still, they were expected to produce heirs, expected to perform. And if they didn't, advisors intervened. Kings and queens alike were sent letters, sometimes instructions. You must lie together every third night. The queen must not bathe in cold water. The king should avoid drinking too much wine. Advice delivered with a straight face inked in solemn script, as if fertility were a chessboard one could master with rules and diagrams. Let's move again. This time to a palace in Mughal India. The harem walls glow gold in the candlelight. Eunuchs patrol the corridors not for danger, but for order. They are the gatekeepers of the emperor's intimacy. No one enters or exits without their knowledge. Each woman's presence is accounted for. Each visit recorded in ledgers. And yet within these walls rivalries burn hot. Every woman desires one thing a night. Just one night with the emperor. Because a single night could mean a child. And a child that means power. A life of comfort, influence, perhaps even a future as the Queen Mother. So the women charm, plot, sabotage. They write poems, they bribe servants, they offer subtle glances when the emperor walks by. Some are never chosen. Others are summoned once then forgotten. And even if you're the favorite, your place is never safe. Jahangir, one of the great Mughal emperors, was enamored with his wife Nur Jahan. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant. She advised him on state matters, issued edicts in her name, and controlled court appointments. But her influence began in the bedroom. It always did. Her political clout was built on a foundation of affection and access. You can almost see her now, seated in perfumed darkness, eyes lined with kohl, listening as a eunuch delivers news of her summoned presence. She knows what's expected. She also knows what she intends to ask after the candles are snuffed. This is not merely romance, it's maneuvering, because sex in royal palaces was always laced with negotiation. Even in later centuries, with the rise of Enlightenment ideals and changing morals, royal sexuality didn't escape scrutiny. In the Habsburg court of 19th century Austria, Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, was admired for her beauty and famously reclusive. She abhorred the pressures placed on her body. After producing heirs, she retreated from intimacy altogether. She focused instead on travel poetry and solitude. But even in withdrawal, she was watched, gossiped about. Her refusal to participate in the expected rituals made her a mystery. And in royal life, mystery was rarely safe. And what of same-sex desire? It existed, of course. But in the courts, it was layered with secrecy and fear. In many eras, being caught in such an affair could result in exile, disgrace, or execution. Yet it happened. In the court of James I of England, the king's affection for his male favorites Robert Carr and later George Villiers was well known, though always cloaked in ambiguous language. James wrote Villiers letters that today read unmistakably as love letters. And yet the court had to pretend. Pretend it was friendship. Pretend it was loyalty. Pretend it was politics. Because naming it that was unthinkable. So you find yourself in another corridor, this time hearing not moans or prayers, but poetry. Quiet verses passed between forbidden lovers. Eyes meeting across feasting halls. Glances exchanged, hands brushed in passing. And that too was royal sex. Not always loud, not always violent, but always dangerous. Now the palace grows quieter still. Only the deepest secrets remain buried beneath stone floors and behind sealed letters. You think of all the bodies that once lay on these beds. Queens, mistresses, kings, servants, lovers, each with their hopes, their fears, their duty, each one used by the palace, and sometimes using it in return. Now close your eyes again. You're not just in one palace, you're in all of them. The silk from Versailles, the marble from Vienna, the incense of Delhi, the cold towers of Stockholm. All of them wrap around you like a quilt of stories, heavy, intimate, eternal. And what they all whisper is this royal sex was never just about bodies. It was about power. You're lying still now, but your mind continues to wander deeper, quieter, into the folds of centuries where royal desire was never simple. Beneath the drapes and silks, behind the stony facades and stained glass windows, something raw pulsed the constant push and pull between what the body wanted and what the crown demanded. And so the question lingers. What happened when those two things didn't align? You find yourself in a candlelit chamber of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Here power was decentralized, kings elected. Marriage was still strategic, but not always successful. King Sigismund III, devoutly Catholic and deeply committed to political image, had a stormy marriage with Anna of Austria. Though they had children, accounts speak of tension, of unspoken rifts, of a queen living in a foreign land she barely understood. In these royal unions, incompatibility was never just emotional, it was dangerous. A royal couple who could not find harmony in bed often failed to produce stability in court. And so came the meddling. Courtiers suggested aphrodisiacs, love philters, and herbal remedies to stoke desire. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they didn't. More often, they only added layers of awkwardness and pressure. Imagine that being fed powdered beetles or spiced wine by a physician who believes your lack of intimacy is a failure of digestion or blood balance. Your body is no longer your own. It's a prescription, a project, a political experiment. And in the courts of early modern Europe, privacy was practically non-existent. Rooms had layers of thresholds, but not insulation. Doors were seldom locked. Even queens often shared chambers with ladies-in-waiting who never left their side. Kings had pages, guards, and valets constantly hovering. The royal bed was rarely just for two. You begin to understand why secrecy, real secrecy, was so rare. And when it did happen, it became legend. Take the story of Catherine the Great. The Empress of Russia was a woman of formidable intellect, ambition, and appetite. After deposing her husband in a coup, she ruled alone for decades. She also famously took a series of lovers, some public, some whispered about. While popular myth eventually twisted her into a caricature, the reality was more nuanced. Catherine used her relationships not merely for pleasure, but for strategy. Her favorites were often elevated to positions of power. She gifted them lands, titles, influence. In return, they gave her loyalty, companionship, and sometimes genuine affection. But the relationships were always conditional. When passion faded, the lovers were dismissed, but generously. They were pensioned off, married well, or quietly reassigned. Catherine ensured they left with their dignity intact, because above all, she understood the stakes. Even for an empress, sex was never just sex. And what of the pregnancies that came at the wrong time or from the wrong bed? Throughout the centuries, queens and princesses were always at risk, because their power was directly tied to the legitimacy of their offspring. A child born out of wedlock could ruin not just a reputation, but a treaty. And yet, these children existed, quietly, secretly, sometimes smuggled away to convents or raised by distant cousins. One chilling example comes from the court of Louis XV. His mistresses bore him numerous children, many of whom were never formally acknowledged. Some were quietly integrated into noble families. Others vanished into silence. For these women, pregnancy wasn't always a path to power. It could mean dismissal, disgrace, or worse. Now imagine you're one of them. A favorite of the king, once bathed in gifts and attention. But now your waist thickens. Your face grows pale. You bleed less. And suddenly, the gaze shifts. He visits less. Courtiers grow cold. You're no longer an amusement, you're a liability. And in the rare moments when a royal woman bore a child outside marriage, the punishment was swift and brutal. One such tale comes from the Spanish court, where Infanta Eulalia, headstrong, intelligent, and fiercely independent, dared to speak openly about politics, sex, and religion in the late 19th century. Though not disgraced by an affair, she was exiled for her opinions alone. Imagine what would have happened had she acted on them. In some courts, even suspicion of infidelity could trigger confinement. Husbands didn't need proof, just whispers. In the Prussian court, women were locked away for offending decorum, whether real or perceived. They were declared unwell, hysterical, or in need of spiritual retreat. In truth, they were being disappeared. And so you lie there again, eyes half closed, breathing shallow, not from arousal, but from the crushing awareness that you too would be watched, judged, held accountable for your body in ways that defy imagination. Not all royal affairs ended in tragedy, though. Some evolved into enduring partnerships. King Charles II of England maintained a warm and open relationship with his favorite Nell Gwyn. A former actress, Nell was witty, popular with the people, and refreshingly blunt. She bore him 2 sons and remained a fixture of his court until his death. But make no mistake, her position, like that of every royal mistress, was temporary, conditional, always at the mercy of his favor. You notice now that every story, no matter how gilded, contains a crack, a moment of risk, a breath held too long, a glance that meant too much. Even in Eastern Asia, where the art of intimacy was cultivated with almost spiritual reverence, palace sex remained wrapped in strategy. In imperial Japan, consorts of the emperor were often selected not just for beauty, but for political alliances. Their movements were regulated, their correspondence monitored. Poetry there became the only safe space. Hidden meanings in haiku and tanka allowed women to express love, longing, rejection, without ever naming names. And so lovers courted each other through verse. They exchanged silk fans with inked poems. They met beneath cherry blossoms at night, accompanied by only the wind and fate. And still each moment risked everything, because the walls of a royal palace have memory. and they do not forgive. You roll onto your side, now your head on embroidered velvet. You think of how much has been hidden, how much has been sacrificed, the moans and cries and laughter that never made it into history books, the stolen moments, the broken hearts, the children who never knew their fathers, the women who never chose their lovers, and always the weight of expectation. For in royal palaces, sex may have been silent, but its consequences roared louder than any trumpet. Your breath settles now into the hush of those long, endless corridors, where every footstep echoes like a secret trying to escape. The weight of silk still lingers on your skin, the imagined warmth of another body long since faded. But the stories, they stay. They settle beside you like ghosts, each one with a tale not of passion or pleasure, but of pressure, consequence, and performance. You find yourself now in the echoing marble halls of the Papal States Rome late Renaissance. The Vatican may not strike you as the setting for sensual scandal, but history disagrees. Because even among the clergy, behind cassocks and cloisters, sexual politics crept in. Popes, cardinals, bishops, many of them were not celibate, not in practice. Their beds, too, became places where ambition lay with desire. Rodrigo Borgia, later Pope Alexander VI, held open relationships with mistresses and acknowledged multiple children. His daughter Lucrezia was married off like a pawn, and his son Cesare was rumored to be both seducer and assassin. The papal apartments hosted banquets that spilled into infamy, complete with dancers, courtesans, and competitions too indecent to name. The church claimed to renounce the body, but the body has always found its way back in. You move quietly now into the Tudor court, where sex wasn't just survival, it was leverage. Consider Elizabeth Bess Blount, mistress of Henry VIII, and mother to his only acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. Her brief ascendancy bought her family land and titles, while her son was showered with favor. But when her use was exhausted, she was married off to a lesser noble, discarded, because even royal pleasure had an expiration date. And then there's the case of Jane Boleyn's sister-in-law to Anne, wife to George. Jane served at court and was tangled in the web of Henry's many affairs. Her eventual involvement in the doomed relationship between Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper would send her to the executioner's block. You realize now that proximity to royal sex wasn't just dangerous for those in the bed, it was fatal for those near it. The entire palace functioned like a nervous system, each chamber a nerve, each affair a jolt. Everyone felt it. Everyone responded. Even children were not spared from the whispers. In some royal houses, boys born from secret liaisons were quietly adopted into the noble class. They bore new surnames, new coats of arms, but they knew. Their mothers knew. The way a courtier looked at them in a corridor. The way a lord whispered bastard when they passed. These were wounds that never quite healed. Girls born outside of marriage fared worse. Some were placed in convents. Some were married off young. Some disappeared entirely, erased from records remembered only by diaries sealed in dust. And their fathers rarely punished. Kings could sin. Queens could not. Now drift east again, this time to the Korean Joseon dynasty. In the royal palaces of Seoul, the Gungyo, the court ladies lived lives of quiet rigidity. They were forbidden from marrying. Many served their entire lives in the court, sworn to the needs of the king and the harmony of the palace. Some were selected to spend nights with the king, chosen based on age, bloodlines, and astrology. If they conceived, they became royal concubines. If not, they returned to silent service. Imagine that decades of devotion waiting for a summons that may never come. And if it does, the outcome could define you or doom you. You pause, leaning against a carved wooden screen. You can almost hear the shuffle of silk slippers, the soft murmur of a palace servant, reciting poetry to a lonely consort in the dark. Even in the stillness, desire lingered, unspoken, trembling, and even in death, sex shaped power. Royal funerals weren't just about honoring a life, they were about cementing legacies. If a monarch died without a legitimate heir, the entire court plunged into chaos. The bedrooms were scoured for evidence, diaries searched, servants interrogated. Was there a mistress, a hidden pregnancy, a bastard son raised in secrecy? In many cases, the truth was buried with the body. And even when heirs were clear, the question of legitimacy often remained. Rival claims, disputed paternity, whispers of falsified births. These led to wars, succession crises, assassinations. The result of one night, one forgotten moment of passion, could shift the balance of history. You walk now past a tapestry in some far-off gallery. It shows Venus and Mars intertwined. A symbol of passion, yes, but also of conquest. Artists throughout the ages knew the truth, that love and war were not opposites, but twins. Palace walls were painted with allegories, swans for fidelity, apples for temptation, peacocks for vanity. Every bedroom bore witness to a secret story told in brushstroke and embroidery. If you looked closely, you could see it, a hand hidden beneath a fold of cloth, a glance cast sideways, a mirror reflecting something not meant to be seen. Because art remembers what people pretend to forget. And always the performance continued. Royal sex was a paradox. It was celebrated and silenced, encouraged and condemned. Hidden behind tapestries and displayed in portraits. It was a tool, a weapon, a vulnerability, and it was lonely. Truly, heartbreakingly lonely. Because love, real love, requires freedom, and there is little freedom behind the throne. You feel that ache now, a longing not for touch, but for choice, for the ability to love without an audience, to sleep without consequence, to kiss without calculation. But you live in the palace, and here nothing is ever yours alone. The candle has nearly burned to the bottom. The wax pools like tears on the stone floor. The wind shifts in the corridor. A memory or perhaps a warning brushes past your cheek. And you understand something more deeply now, that in the heart of every royal bedchamber lies a secret sadness. Because when everything you do is watched, weighed, and judged, even desire becomes a kind of prison. The silence around you thickens. Not empty, not hollow, just heavy, full of echoes from lives lived behind gold-leaf doors and satin curtains. You're still in the palace, though centuries have slipped by. The tapestries have changed. The architecture has evolved. But the story remains the same. Royal bodies are still being traded, bartered, and dressed in ceremonial language to disguise a truth as old as power itself. Sex was never about pleasure. It was about control. You wander now through the corridors of the Habsburg dynasty late into the 19th century. The monarchy is creaking under the weight of modernity, but its customs remain stubbornly medieval in some places. Emperor Franz Joseph sits at the heart of it all, distant, rigid, and dutiful. His wife, Empress Elizabeth Sisi, is a different creature altogether. Sisi was beautiful, famously so, and miserable because of it. Her face became an emblem for the empire, but her body was owned by the crown. She had no privacy, no freedom. And once she had produced heirs, she rejected the royal bed altogether. She starved herself to maintain an idealized figure, took ice-cold baths, and escaped to far-off islands under the guise of health retreats. But beneath those public explanations lay something simpler. She was running. From duty, from expectation, from intimacy turned into obligation. You can almost feel her pacing now, barefoot, her hair unbound, wind in her face as she races along a marble hallway just to feel air that didn't smell like obligation. And it wasn't just women like Cece. Royal men, too, found themselves shackled by roles they didn't choose. In 20th century Japan, Emperor Hirohito was so controlled by imperial protocol that he had to apply in writing for access to his own wife's chambers during their early marriage. Even as the empire modernized, the traditions remained fossilized. Permission to touch. Permission to desire. Even in bed, the emperor was not free. You shift again in the imagined sheets, the fabric of the story wrapping tighter now. Let's return to England for a moment. Edward VII, long before he became king, was infamous for his affairs. His appetite was legendary, and the public was well aware. But here's the twist: his womanizing was considered a sort of insurance policy. If he could bed dozens of women, surely he could father an heir. Masculinity, in royal terms, was performative. The more sexual conquests a prince had, the more virile he appeared. But his wife Alexandra of Denmark had no such allowance. Her role was to remain elegant, chaste, and above all, fertile. 2 bodies, 1 marriage, 2 wildly different sets of rules. And then there were the queens who tried to rewrite the rules altogether. Christina of Sweden, for example, openly rejected marriage and was rumored to have romantic relationships with both men and women. She dressed in men's clothing, refused to marry, and eventually abdicated the throne. She was eccentric, yes, but also utterly unwilling to make her body a battleground for dynastic games. Her decision scandalized Europe, but underneath the shock lay fear. What happens when a royal woman refuses to play the game at all? You breathe slower, now understanding just how much bravery it took not to fight in war, not to sign decrees, but to say no to a lifetime of expected submission beneath the covers. And sometimes the greatest rebellions happened quietly, through delay, refusal, disinterest. There are accounts of royal women feigning illness to avoid the bedchamber, of kings claiming religious fasts to escape their duties, of lovers hidden but never touched, of marriages that existed only on paper and portrait. And yet even these small acts of resistance were seen as dangers, because the royal line must continue, if not through desire, then through force, if not through love, then through law. Now imagine yourself in a French salon during the Ancien Régime. The chandeliers drip with wax, laughter curls through the air like perfume. Behind a painted folding screen, the king reclines with his current mistress. But his gaze is elsewhere. In moments like this, desire isn't personal, it's strategic. Who catches the king's eye might determine the fate of a noble family. One kiss can lead to a title, one touch to exile. It was said that Madame de Pompadour maintained her influence not through sex alone. After all, she ceased being Louis XV's lover after just a few years, but by becoming indispensable. She curated his interests, controlled his access. She was his confidant, his emotional mirror. Even when the sex stopped, the power remained. Because in royal life, influence outlasted intimacy. You close your eyes, and now you're at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. You hear a mother instructing her daughter on how to please a prince. She's not cruel, just practical. She explains the right amount of eye contact, the tone of a letter, the curve of a smile. This isn't love, it's training. Across the world, young royals were prepared not for romance but for alliance. They were taught how to look beautiful but not inviting, how to speak gracefully but not too freely, how to respond to a husband's touch whether desired or not. These weren't marriage lessons, they were survival skills, and you begin to see how deeply the palace defined what intimacy could or could not be. Sex that produced heirs was sacred. Sex that produced scandal was shameful. Sex that had no consequence was ignored. But nowhere was sex simply allowed to be human. You feel the weight of that now lying among imagined cushions and embroidered fantasies. The palace, no matter how beautiful, was a labyrinth, a gilded trap, and in its quietest corners, love suffocated. So you turn onto your back eyes to the imagined canopy overhead, and you ask the question so many royal hearts must have asked. What would it feel like? To be touched, not for duty, not for power, but just for love, a question asked for centuries. Rarely answered, almost never fulfilled. You're deeper now, far beyond the pageantry and silken performance. What was once glittering and ceremonial is now dim and intimate, not in the way of passion, but in the way of truth. You've crossed the threshold of illusion. Here within these stone walls, under these carved beams, and behind these velvet veils, is where the naked reality of royal sex lies, not sensual, but scripted. Tonight you find yourself in Portugal, the court of King João V, a monarch known for wealth, opulence, and a seemingly insatiable appetite for mistresses. He didn't keep one or two. He built an entire convent, the Convento de Odivelas, not for worship, but for pleasure. Nuns were chosen, or perhaps selected, to serve the king in more ways than one. It was whispered, but never openly said, holiness could not protect you if the king desired your body. And within those sacred halls, the line between consecrated and concubine blurred into something that could no longer be spoken aloud. And if that chills you, it should. Because the divine right of kings wasn't just used to command armies or raise taxes, it was used to silence resistance even in the most intimate corners of a woman's life. You cross into the realm of silence now, the unrecorded, the untold, where beds creaked not with joy but with resignation, because the truth was, and still is, royal sex didn't belong to the people participating in it. It belonged to the crown. Even in the most seemingly liberated courts, this was true. In France during the Regency, the Palais Royal was alive with libertinism. Affairs where public sensuality celebrated, and noble circles traded partners as easily as they traded jewels. But even here, behind the indulgence, control remained. The Duke of Orléans, acting as regent for the young Louis XV, was known for his orgies, for hosting masked balls where identities melted and scandal frothed. But participation was political. Invitations weren't merely flirtations, they were favors. Acceptance was currency. Refusal could exile you from influence. Imagine being a lady of the court, handed a card with elegant script and golden trim, an invitation to a private gathering. You know what it means. You know the Duke will be there, and you know saying yes might elevate your husband's position, secure your brother's regiment, protect your father's estate, and so you go. Not because you want to, but because not going would mean being forgotten. Now shift centuries again. You're in Ethiopia during the reign of Emperor Menelik II. Though Christianity shaped the royal court, polygamy was practiced among the nobility. Emperors took multiple wives not for pleasure alone, but for alliances. Each union was a political bridge cemented not with ink, but with flesh. But women too learned to wield that system. Empress Taitu Betul Menelik's wife was not only a partner in name, she was his counselor, his match in intellect and diplomacy. Their union was not just consummated, it was collaborative. She advised him on military strategy, negotiated with foreign powers, and ran the palace with precision. But even she had to maneuver past the ever-present threat of replacement. Her power depended not just on her sharp mind, but on her ability to keep his affection from wandering. And you understand now that royal love, if it existed, was always endangered. It lived in a house of mirrors, fragile, distorted, easily shattered. Let's move to the Ottoman Empire once more. The imperial harem wasn't just a pleasure den, it was a fortress of female politics. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, held more power than most viziers. But she had earned that power not only through childbirth, but through cunning. Years of maneuvering, protecting her son, controlling access to him, even orchestrating who shared his bed. She understood the simple truth: the woman who controls a man's desires often controls his decisions. The stakes of sex were never lower in palaces. They were always higher. One child born in the right bed could rule an empire. One kiss planted in the wrong corridor could start a civil war. And even in moments of supposed liberation, moments when queens or empresses seized their desires, the palace always found a way to reclaim the narrative. Think of Empress Theodora of Byzantium, who rose from humble, even scandalous beginnings to become co-ruler beside Emperor Justinian. Before the crown, she was a performer, an actress, a courtesan. Stories of her seductions were used both to shame her and to elevate her. Her sexuality was her scandal and her weapon. In becoming empress, she rewrote what it meant to be both desired and respected. But it came at a price. No one ever stopped watching her, and no one ever truly let her forget where she began. That's the cost of royal sexuality. You never stop performing. Now the palace around you begins to fade into soft candlelight again. The floor's quiet. The halls seem to breathe. And you, lying beneath embroidered canopies, feel every story settle like dust on your skin. How many women entered these beds out of fear? How many men performed like actors on a stage, even when their hearts ached elsewhere? How many children were conceived in silence, and how many were lost in shame? You know now that the royal bed wasn't a place of rest. It was a throne, a trap, a trial, a tomb. The chandelier above you creaks slightly in the night air. The fire dims, and as the walls exhale centuries of secrets, you begin to understand. To be royal was to be revered, but to be desired as royalty was to be devoured. The fire's glow has dimmed to embers now. The palace is almost still, as if exhausted from centuries of stories that twist and turn behind its walls like ivy, silent but unrelenting. You're still there in that imagined chamber, surrounded by tapestries, heavy with the scent of lavender smoke and memory. The velvet feels heavier now, as if you're wearing history itself. You hear footsteps, again, not hurried ones, but the careful, deliberate tread of someone used to walking where they should not be seen. A secret lover, a trusted servant, a midwife summoned too late. You don't know, but they've walked this path before. Tonight your thoughts drift to the less spoken of roles. Those who existed in the shadows of royal intimacy, not the queens, not the kings, not the mistresses or heirs, but those whose entire lives orbited the business of sex without ever being allowed to name it. Take, for example, the wet nurses. They were summoned after royal births, tasked with feeding the future of empires from their own bodies. Their breasts became part of the royal machine, and yet they were never seen as noble. just necessary. They had no portraits, no titles, no legacies. Their milk nurtured kings. Their names vanished. And what of the midwives, the women who knew the truth of what happened in the royal bed, who knew the timing, the signs, the truth about a stillbirth that might be hidden, or a daughter who would be mourned in silence? These women knew too much, and yet they were often dismissed, exiled, even executed when politics demanded a scapegoat. You feel their presence now in the corner of the room, always watching, always listening, always ready to clean up what history preferred to leave out. Then there were the physicians, educated men who claimed authority over the royal body. They examined queens, took pulse readings, listened for heartbeats in unborn children. Some were healers, others were pawns, and some were spies, whispering their diagnoses into the ears of rival factions, tipping the scales not with swords, but with speculation and the eunuchs. In courts from Byzantium to China, they were assigned to the most intimate spaces, guardians of the royal harem, keepers of secrets. Their bodies had been altered to serve, to protect, to witness. They were both trusted and feared. They moved freely where no other men could. They knew which women were favored, which children truly resembled the king, which letters were hidden beneath the mattress. And what of the spies, for royal courts were full of them? Lovers who reported to rivals, servants who sold information to foreign emissaries, cooks who heard pillow talk, gardeners who knew which windows were opened on which nights. Sex was never isolated. It echoed down hallways, left stains on upholstery, altered succession laws, and invited wars. You walk now through the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, but you're not looking at yourself. You're watching the reflections of all those who came before. The mistress brushing powder from her shoulders after a royal visit. The queen, eyes red-rimmed from another failed month. The chambermaid carrying away sheets that will be burned before dawn. And even in the mirror, no one looks back, because none of them were ever truly seen. Even those in power were trapped inside the theater. In Prussia, King Frederick the Great never showed interest in women. Historians debate the nature of his sexuality, but what remains clear is this: he was forced to marry, forced to play the role, forced to perform. His true affections, perhaps for men, perhaps for no one, had no place in the palace. So he gave his heart to music, to dogs, to solitude, anything but the royal bed. Because when intimacy must be proven, paraded, and politicized, it ceases to be intimate at all. You think of the child brides now, the princesses sent from foreign lands, barely old enough to bleed, told they must bear sons for men they've never met. Some came from hundreds of miles away. Many never saw their parents again. Their first kiss was a contract, their first night a test, their first morning a negotiation. Their entire bodies became chess pieces for people who would never hold their hands. And if they failed, they were sent home in disgrace, or locked away, or quietly poisoned. In the palaces of the Qing dynasty, imperial concubines who displeased the emperor, whether in bed or beyond, could be demoted, ignored, even buried alive. The drama of affection was absolute. It was never mild. And yet, even among the cruelty, real love flickered. You can almost see it hidden in a folded note, a glance across a banquet table, a midnight visit arranged through bribes and risk, a crown prince slipping out through a servant's door to meet someone who made him feel human, a queen tucking a lover's hair ribbon into her prayer book. Those moments existed. They were rare. They were dangerous. But they were real. Love here was like a contraband fruit sweet only because it could be stolen. And then there were the nights when kings wept. alone, in silence, because the woman they loved had been executed, or banished, or wed to another. Their power could command armies, but not protect the one heart that mattered. And queens too wrote poems that were never read. Dried flowers pressed into drawers. Lockets worn beneath ceremonial gowns, pressing close to skin that still remembered the shape of someone they'd been forbidden to touch. Now you understand why sleep in royal beds was always light. Why the walls were never just stone. Why every sigh echoed too loudly. Because in palaces, nothing was ever truly yours. Not your words, not your choices, not even your body. And desire was the one thing they tried to tame, to domesticate, to put in a cage of gold and velvet. But it always found a way to escape. You're so deep in the palace now that the air feels older, thicker. The ceilings rise higher, the corridors stretch farther, and the secrets seem almost sentient. You pass door after door, each one holding the breath of centuries. Behind each a royal bed, a confession never spoken aloud, a history rewritten in whispers. This time the room you enter is cool, dim. A window left slightly ajar lets in the night breeze. A curtain flutters softly. And on the bed, unused tonight, lie carefully folded sheets, prepared for a ritual that may or may not happen. Because now you've reached the private apartments of a royal marriage that no longer functions. These existed more than people liked to admit. In courts across the world, Spain, Austria, Russia, Persia, there were royal couples who simply stopped touching. Publicly, they still appeared at festivals, sat beside each other during mass, raised goblets during state dinners. But privately, they had long since drifted apart. The royal bed, once center stage, had grown cold, and so they invented ways to explain it, to excuse it, to decorate the silence. They blamed health. They cited piety. They said their duty had been fulfilled. But the court always knew. Because in palaces, nothing stays hidden, not even absence. You picture now a nobleman standing in a shaded alcove, smirking as he mutters to another. They haven't shared a bed since the last coronation, and the other nods, already calculating what this might mean. Will there be no more heirs? Could an annulment be arranged? Might there be someone else? Because if there isn't love, there must at least be rumor. And where rumor failed, art filled the gap. In every court, paintings softened the brutal truths. Frescoes showed idealized lovers, Venus and Mars, Cupid and Psyche, always locked in mythic embrace. Never cold, never reluctant, never burdened. But you know better now. Behind every painting of a royal couple entwined in perfection, there might lie a memory of silence. A marriage that survived not on love but on choreography. And then there are the unions that were never meant to include intimacy at all. In the Byzantine Empire, it was not unheard of for emperors to take monastic vows in later life, renouncing all physical pleasures, including the bed. Their wives, still alive, were expected to retreat into quiet dignity, to wither publicly and properly as symbols of chastity and self-denial. It was presented as holy, noble, but it was still abandonment dressed in scripture. And not all unions were between strangers. Some were between cousins, between siblings, between distant bloodlines so entangled by dynastic marriage that their bodies bore the cost. Hemophilia, deformities, infant mortality. Generation after generation, royal sex didn't just create life, it invited death. Slowly, quietly, inevitably. You remember now Charles II of Spain, a tragic king. He could barely speak, could not chew food, could not produce an heir. His body twisted by centuries of royal inbreeding was the consequence of a throne that valued purity of blood over health of flesh. And yet he married twice. Two queens stood by his side, endured the rituals, bore the shame. Both were blamed, but it was never their fault. Because in royal palaces, blame was the one thing always passed down, sometimes wrapped in swaddling clothes, sometimes crowned, sometimes beheaded. And yet, still there were moments when all the duty and protocol cracked just briefly, and something resembling real affection slipped through. You think of Prince Albert writing to Queen Victoria, "I am left with nothing but my love for you." Words sent from a man more private than his wife, who longed only to be her companion, even as she ruled an empire. Or Marie Antoinette locked in Versailles, separated from her children, writing secret notes to Count Fersen. Were they lovers, perhaps? Perhaps not. But the longing in her letters is unmistakable. In those lines you hear not the queen, but the woman. Just a woman begging to feel like herself again. And sometimes love burned so brightly it threatened everything. In 18th century Russia, Grand Duchess Catherine, who would become Catherine the Great, was wed to Peter III. The marriage was cold, loveless, perhaps never consummated. Catherine endured. And then she didn't. She took lovers, carefully, cunningly. And when the time came, she overthrew her husband, placed herself on the throne, and rewrote the entire notion of female power in Russia. And though history has often painted her in scandal, the truth is far more complex. Because Catherine didn't use sex to gain power. She used power to claim the right to her own body. And that made her dangerous. You lie still now in that imagined room with the window open. The curtain still sways. You hear the faintest sound, perhaps footsteps, perhaps breath, perhaps only memory. But you're not afraid. You're beginning to understand that in royal palaces, the truth about sex isn't found in the grand bedrooms or official histories. It's in the discarded letters, the locked diaries, the worn carpet near the bed, the cracked handle on a jewelry box, the way a queen looks at the floor when a name is spoken. Desire was rarely spoken aloud, but it left marks, and now you begin to feel them, faint bruises pressed into the pages of history, invisible to the eye but impossible to forget once traced. A kiss given in haste, a child never named, a bed too big for one person, too cold for two, and always the silence after. You're almost at the heart of it now, the innermost chamber, the final veil. Each step forward feels heavier, not with dread, but with knowing. You've wandered through centuries of secrets, touched silks stained with history, listened to whispers no court chronicler dared write down. Now only the deepest truths remain, the ones even palaces struggle to hold. You step into a room smaller than expected. No gold, no brocade, just a narrow bed, a chest at its foot, a basin on the table. This isn't the chamber of a queen or mistress, not even a noblewoman. This is the room of the forgotten, the illegitimate daughter, the discarded concubine, the once favored lady-in-waiting, now too old to tempt. She lived here. Dozens of women did. Women who once shared the royal bed but not the royal name. Women who bore children that could never inherit, whose pregnancies were kept secret, whose deliveries were hurried and hushed. This room knew labor, blood, wailing, and afterward, nothing. Some of those children were whisked away in silence, raised by distant nobles, or quietly cloistered in convents. Others never made it beyond this room. A weak cry, a still body, a life unlived because it was too dangerous to exist. You sit now at the edge of that narrow bed. You imagine the feel of worn linens, not the crisp, scented kind of ceremonial nights, but the soft, thinning kind from years of being slept in by someone history forgot. And that's the hardest part, isn't it? For every royal lover whose name survives in song or scandal, there were hundreds whose stories were never told. They lived their entire lives as footnotes, if even that. But they were the ones who carried the weight. Their bodies bore the burden. Their mouths stayed shut. Their names were erased. And still the palace spun on. You rise now, moving through the memory of that narrow chamber and into a larger one, decorated, elegant still, but cold. This is a ceremonial marriage bed. You know it instantly by the posture of the people standing around it. A bishop, a pair of noble witnesses, a steward of the king's household, and two teenagers terrified, dressed in embroidered fabrics worth more than a village and yet trembling like paupers. This is their wedding night. It will be witnessed from outside. They will be expected to consummate their marriage, to prove it, to begin a dynastic line. But they know nothing. They were raised on etiquette and embroidery, diplomacy and poetry. No one taught them tenderness. No one spoke of consent. Tonight, they are players in a ritual written generations before they were born. There will be no foreplay, no laughter, just a single act watched for its result and remembered forever for what it may produce. And should the sheets be stained, they will be paraded through the court as proof. Should they not, there will be questions. In that moment, you understand the royal bed was never a place for discovery. It was a courtroom, a testing ground, a spectacle. And even those few who found real connection did so under a ceiling that threatened to collapse at the slightest crack of scandal. You remember Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette again. Their early years were mocked relentlessly by foreign pamphlets. Their failure to conceive quickly became political ammunition. And even when they did produce children, the rumors never stopped, that her lovers were the true fathers, that she was too cold, too wild, too French, too Austrian, too something. Because in the palace, your body was never enough. It was always too much or not quite the right kind. Even men weren't safe from such scrutiny. Take Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria. Groomed for the throne, he was at the center of more than one scandal, one involving a rumored homosexual brothel, another surrounding Jack the Ripper conspiracy theories. No one could prove anything, but his reputation never recovered. He died young. Was it illness or the weight of being watched? Now you pass through one last hallway. The portraits here are blurred intentionally so. Lovers never acknowledged. Children never claimed. Bed partners never painted. Because the palace had a special cruelty for those who didn't fit the narrative. Same-sex lovers, transgressors of gender, royals who refused marriage, who loved below their rank, who refused the bed altogether. They were made invisible, but you feel them, here, still, in the places history tried to erase, in the tear stains hidden under floorboards, in the press of hand against skin remembered long after the lights went out, in the poetry written in margins, in the gifts never returned, in the mourning that couldn't be worn in public. Their stories are not recorded, but they are real. And now you understand the true history of sex in royal palaces isn't in the laws or the lineage. It's in the longing. The moments stolen between obligation, the ache that outlived the empire, and the quiet truth whispered in the dark that power could command 1,000 things, but never love. You walk slower now, not because you're weary, though the weight of all these stories would tire even the strongest heart, but because something sacred lingers in the stillness. You've seen the throne rooms, the banquet halls, the beds embroidered with gold thread, but now you're in the hidden corridors, the ones that never made it into the paintings, the spaces between the spaces. And in these forgotten passages, the walls are softer, warmer. They've been brushed by fingertips in the dark, leaned against in silence, kissed beside, cried upon. Because this is where royal sex truly lived. Not in the marriage contracts or fertility charts. Not in the public bedding ceremonies or the pompous parades. It lived in the stolen hour, the forbidden hand, the longing that looked nothing like duty and everything like danger. Here in this quiet, we remember those who risked everything for one moment of closeness. You imagine now a young prince barely more than a boy riding alone through the trees behind the palace. He stops at a stone bridge, dismounts, and waits. A gardener's son emerges from the other side. They don't speak. They don't dare. But the touch of hands says everything. Their whole lives are shaped by this moment, and neither one will ever tell a soul. Then a princess in another land. Her letters are filled with coded metaphors and references to constellations. She writes them to her tutor, a man she was never supposed to love. When they're discovered, she is forbidden to write again. Her hands tremble when she reads the last page he ever sent, the ink smudged by her own tears. None of these stories are in your textbooks, but they're true. Because sex in royal palaces didn't always follow the rules. No matter how many guards were posted, no matter how calmly midwives or priests or mothers watched, the human heart made its own choices. And sometimes it chose badly. There are the scandals, the ones that burst into daylight and nearly tore monarchies apart. Princess Margaret, sister of Queen Elizabeth II, fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend. Divorced, improper, undesirable in the eyes of the crown. Their love was known, undeniable, and still denied. She was told no, not directly, but through counsel, through pressure, through silence. So she chose duty. She married someone else, but the love remained, quiet, grieving. Other affairs ended less romantically. In 17th century England, Barbara Villiers' mistress to Charles II was envied, hated, and desired all at once. Her affairs were public, her body a constant topic of court gossip. She bore the king several children, but each pregnancy came with new resentment, new political danger. Even as she held power, she never truly held safety. Because to be sexually visible in a royal palace was to become a target. You start to feel it now, the way desire was never just about pleasure. It was currency, strategy, survival. You picture a woman painting her cheeks with crushed berries before entering the king's chamber. Not because she wants to seduce, but because she must. Her father's fortune depends on it. Her brother's title. Her family's future. She lies back on a bed so soft it sinks like a trap. She smiles. She touches. She performs. And when the act is done, she walks out of the chamber not with love, but with leverage. It worked. She'll live another day. Because in these palaces, sex wasn't about who you loved. It was about who you could control or who controlled you. And the cruelest part, sometimes genuine love did arrive. But it was too late. It came to the widowed queen years after she'd done her duty, borne her children, buried her husband. Now at last she finds a man who sees her not as a vessel, not as a symbol, but as a soul. They speak in gardens, they touch under moonlight, but they cannot marry. The crown won't allow it. So they carry the love quietly, like a secret garden that only blooms in the dark. Or worse, love comes at the wrong time, to the wrong person, and it is punished. The mistress sent to a convent, the page whipped and cast out, the foreign ambassador recalled, the chambermaid who disappears, her name never spoken again. You see it now, all of it. The palace was a machine, a beautiful, brutal machine. And sex, real, tender human sex, was the one thing it could never fully contain. So it tried to own it. Through laws, through rituals, through beds built too tall to climb into without help, through songs, through portraits, through letters burned before anyone could read them. But it never quite succeeded. Because even in the most gilded cage, the heart beats. And even behind the thickest door, a sigh can escape. You listen now. Do you hear it, that final breath, not of climax, not of duty, but of longing? It's still echoing. Because history, like the palace, never forgets those who dared to want more than they were allowed to touch. You've reached the final chamber now. Not the grandest, not the most gilded, but the quietest, the stillest, the one no one speaks of because it holds everything the others try to hide. You pause at its threshold, hand resting lightly against a door carved not with crowns or lions, but with ivy. Soft, twisting, untamed. This room was never meant for public view. It is not where kings ruled nor where queens performed. It's where truth was buried. And you step inside. The air is cool, untouched by the smoke and perfume of ceremonial chambers. A single window lets in moonlight falling across a writing desk. On it lies a bundle of sealed letters, never sent, never read. You recognize the handwriting. Over the course of your journey, you've learned to read between the lines. These were love letters, unsent, unreceived, but never unloved. You open one. It begins not with your majesty or my lady, but simply you. That word alone says everything. This was not a letter written for diplomacy. It was a plea, a confession, perhaps even a goodbye. Because sometimes the deepest intimacy in royal palaces never happened in bed at all. It lived in glances that lingered too long in hands, that brushed too close in silences thick with unspoken want. And yet so often those moments had to be buried. Buried beneath duty, buried beneath crowns, buried beneath 1,000 generations of obligation. You sit now in that final room and feel the full weight of it. You remember every chamber you passed, the weddings that weren't wanted, the mistresses who wielded power and were punished for it, the queens who bled for nothing, the kings who touched in secret, the children born in silence, the children never born at all. And then there are the ones we don't know about. The servants who crept into royal beds and crept out again carrying both shame and memory. The lovers whose names were erased from letters, scrubbed from paintings, replaced in songs. The truths that died behind closed doors, whispered once into the dark, and never again. This, then, is what sex inside royal palaces really was. It was public yet silenced, sacred yet exploited, commanded yet feared. It was an act that could create kingdoms or ruin them. It was never simple, never just desire. Always laced with politics, drenched in expectations, sealed with history. But somehow, it was still human. For every transaction, there was a touch that meant something. For every performance, a breath that caught in the throat. For every crown, a heartbeat beneath it. And now in this final quiet, you feel that heartbeat slowing, settling. You are not in a palace anymore. You are not a queen, nor a consort, nor a mistress. You are simply someone who has seen behind the veil, who has heard what the walls tried to forget. And in that knowing there is peace, because truth once whispered never dies. It only waits for someone to listen. You walk back now slowly through every room you've visited. You close each door behind you, gently, with reverence. You thank the ghosts for their honesty. You forgive the walls for their silence. And you take the final step into the darkness where no one is watching. And for the first time tonight, you rest. Let your body soften now. You've wandered through candlelit halls and slipped past centuries of secrets. You've seen the crownless and crowned alike caught in the same web of duty, desire, and unrelenting eyes. You've watched kings perform like actors, queens ache in silence, servants vanish with what they knew, and lovers disappear into history's shadows. But here in this quiet space, there is no pressure, no performance, only rest. Breathe out slowly. Feel the tension of all those layers, corsets of expectation, chains of legacy fall away. The palace is far behind you now. There are no creaking floors, no witnesses, no titles, no beds you didn't choose. There is only the rhythm of your breath and the hush of the night. You did not have to survive what they did, but now you understand it. And that knowing, gentle, tender, without judgment can be enough. So if your thoughts drift now to brocade curtains or moonlit gardens, to letters never sent or sighs never spoken, let them. Let the stories curl around you like blankets. Let the stillness settle over you like a crown with no weight. You are safe here. Not because history was kind, but because tonight you gave it a place to speak. And now, as your eyes grow heavier and the edge of sleep finds you at last, remember this. Not all palaces have walls. Some live in memory, some in the quiet between stories, and some in dreams.